Bhagavad-gita opens with blind Dhritarashtra requesting his secretary Sanjaya to narrate the battle between his sons, the Kauravas, and their cousins, the Pandavas. Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, out of affection for his devotee, the Pandava prince Arjuna, has agreed to drive his chariot. As Arjuna takes up his bow and prepares to fight, he sees the sons of Dhritarashtra drawn in military array and requests infallible Krishna to draw his chariot between the two fighting forces. There, in the midst of both armies, Arjuna's mind reels as he foresees the imminent death of his teacher, relatives, and friends. He throws down his bow and arrows and decides not to fight. In Chapter 1 and at the beginning of Chapter 2, Arjuna presents his arguments for refusing to fight. Basically, he fears the sinful reactions of killing. But after Arjuna surrenders to Lord Krishna and requests the Lord to instruct him, the Lord begins countering Arjuna's objections. First, Krishna analytically explains that no killing can actually take place because the eternal soul never dies. Krishna then explains that fighting in his service is transcendental and will bring no sinful reaction. Krishna also explains the Veda's purpose as being the gradual elevation of souls to Krishna consciousness. Krishna thus encourages Arjuna to remain fixed in his service, to fight, and ignore the mind's desires. As Krishna's explanations why Arjuna should fight were only a summary, and since Krishna glorifies both buddhi yoga, intelligence used in spiritual advancement of knowledge, 245, 249 through 50, and karma, work, 247 through 48, 250, Arjuna becomes confused and wishes to use Krishna's instruction to perform buddhi yoga as an excuse to retire from the battlefield for a life of contemplation. Arjuna therefore opens Chapter 3 by asking Krishna why he is encouraging fighting if intelligence is better than fruitive work. Krishna then explains karma yoga, reaction-free devotional work, and clears up Arjuna's mistaken idea that all work is fruitive and leads to bondage. Krishna explains that Arjuna should fight, for avoiding sinful reactions through devotional work is better than attempting to escape reactions through renouncing work. Krishna also instructs Arjuna to fight to set the proper example of duty. Krishna therefore tells Arjuna to fight, but with knowledge and detachment, 329 through 30, without falling victim to his own attractions and aversions. Then, in answer to Arjuna's question on the cause of a soul's being impelled to improper action or neglect of duty, Krishna names the enemy, lust. He recommends Arjuna regulate his senses, become fixed in his pure identity as a servant of Krishna, and thereby avoid lust's control. With spiritual strength and deliberate intelligence, he should conquer that forceful and sinful enemy, lust. Since in Chapter 3, Krishna has recommended that Arjuna fight in full knowledge of him, 330, the Lord, in Chapter 4, explains different aspects of transcendental knowledge. First, Krishna explains attaining knowledge through the disciplic succession. Then, after successively explaining his own appearance and mission, the Lord explains his devotional service as the goal of all sacrifices. Krishna had already referred to the importance of performing yajna, sacrifice, in 3:9 through 16. Next, Krishna explains the soul's relationship with him as eternally his part and parcel, which must be learned by approaching a bona fide spiritual master. Chapter 4 ends with Krishna glorifying transcendental knowledge and requesting Arjuna to arm himself with this knowledge, which burns all sinful reactions to ashes, and fight. After Arjuna has been impressed with the importance of both work, which requires activity, and seeking knowledge, which tends to be inactive, Arjuna is perplexed. His determination is confused, and he sees fighting and knowledge as contradictory. Therefore, Arjuna opens chapter 5 by asking Krishna to definitively explain whether the renunciation of work, speculation, sankhya, jnana, inaction in knowledge, or work in devotion is superior. Krishna answers that one who is detached from his work's results is the one who is truly renounced. Such a person knows that while the body acts, he, the soul, actually does nothing. Arjuna should, therefore, do his duty and steadily act for the satisfaction of Krishna. Impartially viewing the external world, he should reside in his body aloof from bodily activities. By fixing his consciousness on the Supreme and knowing that Krishna is the true enjoyer, the goal of sacrifice and austerity, and the Lord of all planets, he, the pure soul, will find true peace beyond this material world. In the first 5 chapters, Krishna has explained Buddhi Yoga, working with the consciousness focused on Krishna without fruitive desires. The Lord has also explained Sankhya, Karma Yoga, and Jnana Yoga as processes to obtain liberation and as stepping stones to Krishna consciousness. At the end of the 5th chapter, 5:27 through 28, and continuing on to the 6th chapter, wherein Krishna explains practical points for a yogi, Krishna explains Dhyana Yoga, concluding that dhyana, or meditation on Krishna, is the goal of meditation. Krishna begins the 6th chapter by explaining that the neophyte yogi engages in fruitive sitting postures while the advanced yogi, the true sannyasi, works without attachment. Such a yogi liberates himself and is not degraded by his mind's activities, carefully controlling his mind, body, and self in Krishna's service. The yogi strictly practices dhyana yoga in a secluded place. Fixing his mind on the self and on Krishna, he attains transcendental happiness in the kingdom of God. Arjuna then points out that the main difficulty in practicing yoga is controlling the mind. Krishna responds by saying that one can overcome the obstinate mind through constant practice and determination. In responding to Arjuna's query about the fate of an unsuccessful yogi, Krishna answers that one unsuccessful in his practice will still take birth in a family of wise transcendentalists and automatically become attracted to yogic principles. Krishna finally states in the last 2 verses of the chapter that the yogi is greater than the ascetic, the jnani, and the karmi, and the greatest of all yogis is he who always thinks of Krishna and with great faith worships him in loving service. Knowing Krishna's instruction at the end of chapter 6, one should initiate his practice of yoga from the point of concentrating the mind on Krishna. Chapter 7 thus opens with Krishna explaining knowledge of himself and his opulent energies. Thus, Arjuna can fully worship Krishna as described at the end of chapter 6 and think of him with devotion as he fights. Krishna first explains that he is the supreme truth and that everything in existence is a combination of his material and spiritual energies. He is the active principle within all and is all-pervasive through his diverse material and spiritual energies. Because the modes of nature, which emanate from Krishna and which do not affect him, control the world's activities, only those who surrender to Krishna can cross beyond these modes to know him. 4 kinds of impious souls never surrender to Krishna, while 4 kinds of pious souls do. Krishna also covers himself from the impersonalists, who are less intelligent, and from those who surrender to demigods. But those who are truly pious, the undiluted, serve Krishna with determination and practice their devotional service on the Brahman platform, which is the goal of the impersonalists. Those souls who know Krishna as the governor of the material manifestation, the demigods, and sacrifice can know and understand Krishna even at the time of death. Chapter 8 begins with Arjuna asking Krishna about Brahman, karma, the demigods, the material world, and knowing him at the time of death. Krishna briefly answers Arjuna's first 5 questions and then begins explaining in detail how to know him at the time of death. Since one attains what one remembers at the time of death, if one remembers Krishna, one goes to him. Krishna then explains how he can be constantly thought of as the transcendental person who knows everything, as the oldest, the controller, the smallest, and the maintainer. Thus, by practicing yoga and remembering him, Krishna explains, one will go to the eternal spiritual world and never again return to this temporary, miserable material world. After describing the different yogic ways in which one may leave this world, Krishna advises Arjuna not to worry about other paths, either Vedic study, yoga, austerities, sacrifices, charity, jnana, or karma, for the results of all these will be obtained through performing devotional service. And in the end, such a yogi in devotion reaches the supreme eternal abode. After Krishna answers Arjuna's questions in chapter 8, he continues speaking. In chapter 9, the knowledge about himself that he had begun explaining in chapter 7. Krishna prefaces chapter 9 by stating that the knowledge he will now reveal is most confidential, for it is about his actual position, which only the non-envious and faithful can understand. Krishna continues explaining that although independent and aloof, he pervades, creates, and annihilates the entire cosmos through his material energy. Those Mahatmas who know Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead take shelter of him and serve him as the only enjoyer and the supreme object of worship. Krishna then explains the fortunate position of such devotees. If one worships Krishna, Krishna cares for him, compensates for his deficiencies, and preserves his strengths. And all Krishna asks for is an offering of a leaf, a flower, or some water, if it is offered with devotion. Thus his devotees come to him. Even if a devotee unintentionally commits a horrendous act, he will be rectified, for Krishna promises that his devotee will never perish. In chapters 7 and 9, Krishna has explained knowledge of his energies. In chapter 10, Krishna explains his opulences more specifically and thereby reveals himself as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the source of all. Krishna also tells how his pure devotees know that he is the unborn Supreme Lord, the source of all sages, the source of the material and spiritual worlds, and the source of all qualities and attitudes. Thus, pure and wise devotees worship Krishna, converse about him, and with thoughts dwelling in him, undiluted and free from sin, they engage in his service. Out of compassion, Krishna, within their hearts, destroys any remaining ignorance. After hearing of Krishna's opulences, Arjuna confirms Krishna as the Supreme Lord by quoting authorities, and explains that only Krishna can truly know himself. Krishna then tells of his divine manifestations within this world, as the Supersoul, the ocean, the Himalayas, which merely indicate his limitless opulences. For a single fragment of Krishna's energy pervades and supports this entire universe. Arjuna, although acknowledging that Krishna in the two-armed form that he now sees before him is supreme, still requests Krishna to reveal his all-pervading universal form that supports the universe. Thus, in chapter 11, Krishna proves himself the Supreme Lord, and he establishes the criterion that anyone who claims to be God must also show a universal form. Krishna reveals to Arjuna his wondrous, effulgent, all-expansive form, and Arjuna sees all soldiers on both sides dying within it. Krishna explains his form as time, the destroyer of all the worlds, and requests that Arjuna, knowing in advance of the inevitable deaths of all the warriors, become his instrument. In answer to Arjuna's fearful prayers, Krishna first shows his four-armed form before again returning to his original two-armed form. Krishna then states that this two-armed form can be seen only by pure devotees, and such pure devotees, working for Krishna, free from desire for fruitive activities, making Krishna the supreme goal of their lives, certainly come to him. In chapter 12, Arjuna, after witnessing Krishna's awesome universal form, wishes to confirm his own position as a devotee, the highest worshipper of the Supreme. He thus asks whether worshipping Krishna through devotional service or worshipping the impersonal is superior. Krishna immediately responds, saying that one engaged in his personal service is the topmost. One should therefore engage in Krishna's service and fix his mind solely on Krishna. If that cannot be done, one should follow the rules and regulations of Bhakti Yoga, which purify one, so he is able to do so later. Krishna then describes other processes that eventually lead to his pure devotional service. The qualities that endear a devotee to Krishna, such as equality in both happiness and distress, independence from the ordinary course of activities, satisfaction, and the faithful following of the path of devotional service, are also mentioned as part of the process of worshiping Krishna in devotional service. Arjuna opens chapter 13 inquiring about the field of activities and the knower of that field. Krishna answers that the conditioned soul's body and the body's interactions with the material world are his limited field of activities. By understanding the difference between the body, the soul, and the supersoul, and by following the process of knowledge, the soul can transcend dualities, realize his eternal subordination to Krishna, and attain the supreme destination. The 13th chapter clearly explains that by humbly developing knowledge, one can become freed from material entanglement. It also explains that the living entity's entanglement within the material world is due to his association with the modes of material nature, 13:20 through 22. In chapter 14, the Supreme Personality explains in detail the three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, as the forces that bind and control all conditioned souls within this world. A soul can, however, transcend these modes through devotional service. All other processes are contaminated by the modes. Thus, the limitations imposed by his field of activities can be overthrown, and the soul can be elevated to the Brahman platform, the constitutional position of purity and happiness, a platform of which Krishna is the basis. As one must be detached from the modes and their results in order to be attached to the service of the Lord, Krishna describes in chapter 15 the process of freeing oneself from matter's grip. He begins by comparing the material world to a gigantic upside-down banyan tree, inviting Arjuna to detach himself from it through surrender. Thus the soul can end his transmigrations and return to him in the spiritual world. Although the foolish cannot understand that the soul transmigrates from one body to another according to the mind's desires, transcendentalists see this clearly. The foolish can learn to see properly by knowing Krishna as the splendor of the sun, moon, and fire, as the one keeping the planets in orbit and making vegetables succulent, as the fire of digestion, as the Paramatma in everyone's heart, as the giver of remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness, and as the goal of the Vedas and the compiler of Vedanta. Krishna reveals that knowing him as the Supreme Personality of Godhead and engaging in his service is the ultimate purpose of the Vedanta and the most confidential part of the Vedas. In chapter 15, auspicious, elevating activities are described as part of the banyan tree. In chapter 16, after mentioning 26 godly qualities, Krishna explains the demoniac nature which degrades the soul through arrogant, ignorant, and conceited pursuits of sense gratification and power. Krishna explains the demoniac mentality as follows. The demoniac think the world is unreal and produced only of sex desire. Taking shelter of lust, they think of sense gratification as the goal of life and scheme to illegally increase their wealth. While plotting to kill their enemies, they think themselves powerful and happy. And surrounded by their relatives, they use sacrifices and charity only to further increase their happiness. Perplexed by illusory anxieties, bewildered by complacency, impudency, and wealth, and envying the supersoul within their own bodies and within the bodies of others, demons blaspheme real religion. These mischievous, lowest of men, are repeatedly cast by Krishna into demoniac species and gradually sink to the most abominable forms of existence. Krishna ends the chapter by explaining that because lust, anger, and greed are the beginning of demoniac life, all sane men should give them up and understand their duty by faithfully following the scriptures. Krishna concludes chapter 16 by declaring that the ultimate difference between the divine and the demonic is that the divine follow the scriptures while the demons do not. At the beginning of chapter 17, Arjuna inquires more about those who don't follow scriptures but who worship according to their imagination. Krishna answers by describing how the combination of the modes of material nature that control a particular person will dictate his faith, worship, eating, sacrifices, charity, and austerity. The chapter ends with Krishna explaining the syllables Om, Tat, Sat, and how these syllables indicate that any sacrifice, austerity, or charity dictated by the modes and performed without devotional service is useless in this life and the next. One should therefore directly take to Krishna's service and Krishna consciousness. The entire Bhagavad-gita is concluded in 17 chapters, and in the 18th chapter, Krishna reviews the knowledge already presented. In this chapter, Krishna concludes, as he has done throughout the Bhagavad-gita, that one should practice devotional service, Krishna consciousness. Since Arjuna's basic reason to renounce his duty of fighting was fear of sinful reaction, Krishna explains true renunciation and how to transcend sinful reactions through 1. Becoming renounced from the fruits of activities, 2. Abiding by the order of the Supersoul, and 3. Worshipping the Lord with the fruit of one's work by acting either as a Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra according to one's mode of nature. Each leads Arjuna to fight. Thus one can achieve the self-realized position of Brahma Bhuta, and from that position, detached from all material things, one can practice pure devotional service. Krishna can be known only through surrendering to him in devotional service, and by this direct process, free from karma or jnana, Arjuna need not fear any sinful reactions. Under Krishna's protection, such a pure devotee will reach Krishna Loka. Krishna instructs Arjuna that he should surrender to the Supreme Lord within his heart and thus attain peace in the supreme, eternal abode. The most confidential knowledge is then explained by Krishna. Become my devotee, always think of me, act for me, worship me, and offer all homage unto me. Surrender unto me alone. Do not fear sinful reactions. After hearing the instructions of Sri Krishna, Arjuna is fixed and ready to fight. Sanjaya, after narrating this conversation to Dhritarashtra, ecstatically thinks of the wondrous universal form of Krishna and predicts victory for Arjuna, the supreme archer, for he is surrendered to Krishna, the master of all mystics.